Welcome. Do you feel like you're a people pleaser? Make sure to watch the whole video because I'll be going over some journal prompts to help you at the end. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the notifications bell if you enjoy this content. My name is Stephanie. You probably know me as Altered States of Consciousness. If you watched my last video, then you already know about the most recognized trauma responses: fight, flight, and freeze. If you haven't watched it yet, I highly suggest you do for a little more info before we dive into fawning. I'll link it at the top of the screen and in the description. Comment below if you feel like a people pleaser. Let's start a conversation about it. Okay, so let's get right into our topic. Today we're going to be talking about fawn, the people-pleasing trauma response. People who have lived through trauma develop very specific coping mechanisms. Individuals that have experienced physical, verbal, and emotional trauma in childhood tend to develop a range of responses to situations that bring up the trauma they experienced as a child. Many people experience some type of trauma in their lives that could affect their coping mechanisms in relationships. Most people have heard of fight or flight, which are the two typical responses to traumatic situations. When faced with a trigger that relates to the trauma, the person will become defensive, aggressive, or protective of themselves as a coping mechanism, or they try to get away from the problem by using the flight coping mechanism. A third response has been identified. It is called the freeze response. With this response pattern, the person will mentally freeze and tries to pretend the issue is not there by engaging in unrelated thoughts and focusing on other things. The person becomes unable to make a decision to fight or flee as they are unable to acknowledge the trauma or take any action. It is common for people to use all three of these trauma responses based on the kind of trauma or trigger that is bringing up the original trauma. An example would be someone who uses flight to avoid crowds but becomes verbally aggressive if they feel they are under attack. And when they are overwhelmed, they avoid addressing the issue. We must realize that the threats that trigger these trauma responses are sometimes real, or they can be safe situations that are perceived by the trauma survivor to be threatening. Those of us with traumatic childhoods are hypervigilant to changes in tone and environmental triggers that bear resemblance to trauma from the past. What people pleasers need to know about the fawn response. Pete Walker, who I quoted in my last video, has identified another response pattern, which he describes as the fawn response. I'm going to paraphrase from his website, and I will link it in the description. A final scenario describes the budding codependent toddler who largely bypasses the fight, flight, and freeze response and instead learns to fawn their way into the safety of becoming helpful. She may discover that a certain amount of safety, as safety is the ultimate goal of all of the 4F responses, can be gained by becoming useful to the abusive parent. Servitude, people-pleasing, and denial of any needs that might inconvenience the parent become the most important survival strategies available. Boundaries of every kind are surrendered to please the parent, as the parent refuses the duty of being a parent to the child. The child is parentified and instead becomes as useful to the parent as they can be, as a housekeeper, confidant, sounding board, surrogate parent of other siblings, etc. All this loss of self begins before the child has many words, and certainly no insight. For the child, all hints of danger soon immediately trigger behaviors to serve an annihilation of their own rights and needs. These response patterns are so deeply set into the psyche that as adults, many codependents automatically and symbolically respond to threat like dogs, rolling over on their backs, wagging their tails, hoping for a little mercy and an occasional scrap of food. In fact, Webster's second entry for fawn is especially of a dog to behave affectionately. I find it particularly disturbing the way some codependents can be as loyal as a dog to even the worst master. I've had considerable success using education about this type of mental wiring with those whose codependency began as a childhood response to parents who continually attacked and shamed any self-interest on their part. Such clients need help to understand how their habits of automatically forfeiting boundaries, limits, rights, and needs were and are triggered by a fear of being attacked, or lapses in obedience. Clarification of this dynamic to fawn types is a necessary but not sufficient step in recovery. There are many codependents who understand why they are abandoning themselves, but seem to quickly forget everything they know when confronted with the need to change their relationships. To break free of their people-pleasing habits, they must turn their cognitive insights into a willingness to stay present, to face the fear that triggers the fawn response. And in the face of that fear, try to practice more functional responses to fear. Real motivation for overcoming this challenge usually comes from the work of uncovering and recreating a detailed picture of the trauma that first frightened the trauma survivor out of his instincts of self-protection and healthy self-interest. When the survivor remembers and feels how overpowered he was as a child, he can begin to realize that although he was truly too small and powerless to assert himself in the past, he is now in a much different, more potentially powerful situation. And while he might still momentarily feel small and helpless when he is in a flashback, he can learn to remind himself that he is in an adult body and that he now has an adult status that offers him many more resources to champion himself and to effectively protest unfair behavior. I usually find that this work involves a considerable amount of grieving. Typically, this entails many tears around the loss and pain of being so long without healthy self-interest and self-protective skills. Grieving also tends to unlock healthy anger about a life lived with such a diminished sense of self. This anger can then be worked into recovering a healthy fight response that is the basis of the instinct of self-protection, of balanced assertiveness, and of the courage that will be needed in the journey of creating relationships based on equality and fairness. To facilitate the reclaiming of assertiveness, which is usually later stage recovery work, I sometimes help by encouraging the client to imagine themselves confronting a current or past unfairness. This often is delicate work, as it is sometimes akin to therapeutically invoking an emotional flashback, and therefore requires a great deal of trust. When the unmastered threatening situation has been successfully reinvoked, the client has an opportunity to become more aware of how fear arises and to practice staying present to it and its associations. This then sets a stage for the deconstruction of internal and external self-destructive reactions to fear, as well as the continued grieving out of the pain associated with past traumas. Finally, I have noticed that extreme emotional abandonment also can create this kind of codependency. I believe that the continuously neglected toddler experiences extreme lack of connection as traumatic and sometimes responds to this fearful condition by overdeveloping the fawn response. That was all paraphrased from Pete Walker's website. I'll have it linked below in the description, and I'll have his book linked below as well. So as you can see, this response is similar to what we call people-pleasing, which is a common behavior for traumatized children. This behavior pattern may be effective in a dysfunctional family in order to avoid abuse of any type. However, it will also add to the inability of the trauma survivor to articulate needs, and they will learn to give in to the demands of others as the survivor grows into an adult. The people-pleasing and giving in becomes the coping mechanism. This is similar to the walking on eggshells response that develops in families of alcoholics and drug abusers. The trauma survivor learns that they can avoid the emotional, verbal, and often physical abuse if they can fulfill a need of the abusive or addicted parent, thus setting them into a locked pattern for life. Making a choice to end an argument by telling the other person they are right or doing what someone else wants to avoid disagreement can sometimes be examples of healthy ways of dealing with a stressful situation. Being empathetic to others is another healthy response. But Fawn Response goes well beyond the healthy state of dealing with a situation to the point of an individual remaining in a physically, emotionally, and verbally abusive relationship to keep the abuser happy. Another important feature is that the individual can end up compromising their own needs and values in a situation simply to avoid conflict. Some common signs of a fawn response: putting others first in all situations, lack of boundaries in relationships, doing whatever it takes to keep everyone around you happy, doing whatever it takes to avoid a conflict, difficulty in seeing your importance in a relationship, inability to say no or internal pressure to always say yes. Fear of being abandoned if you ask for specific things in a relationship. Continually attempting to read and accommodate the other person's needs. Focus on always being good enough for those around you. Lack of self-esteem and self-worth. The fawn response, like all types of coping mechanisms, can be changed over time with awareness, commitment, and sometimes therapy is needed. In codependent types of relationships, these tendencies can slip in, and although it relieves the tension at the moment, it is not a solution for a healthy and lasting relationship. Pay attention to these traits in your relationships. Learning to draw boundaries and stand in your own corner offers the possibility of personal development and happier relationships. Being aware is the first step to change. So step out on the journey to caring and loving yourself. Here are some journal prompts to get you started. What coping mechanisms do you use most often? Are they healthy coping mechanisms? Are there better coping mechanisms you can use? What support might you need? Be sure to share your thoughts and questions using the comment section below, so we can all learn from and help each other. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the notifications bell to be notified when I post new videos. I'll be showing you all more about trauma responses in the future. See you all next time.